Hi, I'm Frances Gaines, and it's my pleasure to welcome you today. We want to start with our land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that Indigenous peoples and nations, including Mohican, Mashantucket, Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Skagit, Golden Hill Pecosset, Niantic, and Quinnipiac and other Algonquin-speaking peoples have stewarded through generations the lands and waterways of what is now the state of Connecticut. We honor and respect the enduring relationship that exists between these peoples and nations and this land. In the early 1800s, Percy Bysshe Shelley wrote his famous poem, Ode to the West Wind. He concluded with his last line, "O wind, if winter comes, can spring be far behind?" Whoever would have thought 200 years later, here we are, having said maybe those same words many times, maybe even shouting them after completing such a difficult year. Keeping that thought in mind, we decided to launch this season with our theme, honoring beauty and healing nature around us and celebrating the ordinary and the extraordinary. And what could be a better fit than to honor author Gina Rae La Cerva to talk about how our evolution as hunter-gatherers relying on nature still affects us and why eating wild plants might be the key to reconnecting to our environments and each other. Gina Rae La Cerva is a geographer and environmental anthropologist. Her first book, Feasting Wild in Search of the Last Untamed Food, was recommended by the New York Times Summer Reading List and selected as the best nonfiction book of 2020 by Amazon. As an avid adventurer, La Cerva has researched tsunamis in Indonesia, crossed the Pacific Ocean on a sailboat, followed the wild meat trade from rainforests of Congo Basin to the streets of Paris. She holds degrees from Yale University, University of Cambridge, and Vassar College. We're also very excited to present forager Alexis Nikole Nelson, who will be joining Gina Rae in conversation after her talk. Alexis is a forager and content creator who is on a mission to teach the world about the abundance of food hiding in our yards and cities. She works to help her 1 million followers eliminate their plant blindness and learn the complicated history of foraging in the US, all while singing and cooking up a storm. I love your free spirit, Alexis, I really do. We hope that many of you enjoyed the opportunity to savor the thoughtful and delicious three-course meal prepared by Small Kitchen Big Taste, featuring Connecticut ingredients designed especially for this occasion. And Gina Rae's book, if you haven't ordered it already, can be obtained at People Get Ready Books, where a limited number with signed book plates are available. This program has been generously sponsored by the Office of the Secretary and Vice President for University Life and the Bromley Fund. It's also presented in partnership with the Afro-American Center at Yale and the Yale School of Environment. Now, there will be a question for you to ask questions at the end of today's program. You have the chat function available on your screen for community and conversation only. If you do have a question, be sure to use the Q&A function, and you could submit it anytime during the webinar. Please know that we typically receive more questions than our presenters have time to answer, so we apologize in advance if we don't get to yours. Now, enough from me. Gina Rae, I'm hungry to hear your talk.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, Frances, and thank you to everyone who's spending their afternoon or evening with us today. And also, thank you to Alexis for agreeing to be in conversation with me. I'm really looking forward to that. So I'm just going to give a brief talk. Let me see if I can figure out how to share my screen. Only done it a million times. So I'm going to talk about how wild plants went from sustenance and something we all ate to really being a rarity and a luxury. I also wanted to do a brief land acknowledgement, as I am speaking to you today from the traditional lands of the Tewa and Tano people on unceded territory that is called Oga Poge Owinge, White Shell Water Place, also known as Santa Fe, New Mexico. So as Frances said, I am a geographer, environmental anthropologist, and the author of this book. I spent many years researching it and traveled all around the world. But as I said, today I'm going to talk about our history, our deep history. So for 99% of human history, we hunted and gathered. Today, most people will never eat anything undomesticated or uncultivated. How did this happen? In fact, there's evidence that humans have used 30,000 different plant species for food or medicine. It was likely women who provided the majority of food calories in early human societies. So actually, we should be called gatherer-hunters rather than hunter-gatherers. The first tools were likely woven satchels used to carry gathered foods home, which you can see an example of on the left. Nevertheless, petroglyphs rarely show food gathering depictions alongside their images of epic hunts. Although there is one Mesolithic drawing found in a cave in Spain where there's a picture of the collection of honey, which you can see on the right side of your screen there. The first agriculture was actually probably an accident. Bits of gathered root and seeds fell out on the way home and re-sprouted. And given women's role in gathering, it is likely that they took notice of these events and began to coax plants into domestication. We do not know for certain how this began, but we do know that the first major agricultural crops evolved from wild versions that were already a major part of the diet. Cereals in the Near East, maize and beans in Central and South America, and rice in China. Surprisingly, the risk of going hungry was not dampened by agriculture, and actually in the beginning was quite difficult, particularly when crop breeding was in its early stages. Whereas for most of our history, we ate what was seasonally available, when we began to farm, it became necessary to wait for crops to come in. Food storage was also risky. Stockpiles could degrade or be raided. And by many physical measures, hunter-gatherers were actually much healthier than agriculturalists. With a conversion to farming, there was an increase in shortened lifespans, stunted growth, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, tooth decay, and exposure to new parasites and infections. The quality of life reversal was particularly bad for women. They had less access to protein than under more egalitarian hunter-gatherer regimes. And it took much more labor to produce an agricultural crop than to go out gathering. This meant that they had to have a lot more children, and combined that with the higher rates of child mortality due to new diseases, they had an increasing number of children, which is a primary burden of physical stress. But as agriculture became the dominant method for sourcing food, wild plants took on a new spiritual value. They were used during spring fertility rites in the Iron Age, and sought after as remedies for the diseases caused by moving toward agriculture in the first place. Ancient Greek and Roman doctors believed that the power of wild plants to cure was because they resembled human needs. This idea, called the doctrine of signatures, meant that if a flower resembled an eye, it could treat eye infections. If the petals were triangular or flesh-colored, like the human heart, the plant would remedy chest pains and heartbreak. This belief became popular again in Europe during the medieval period, and wild plant-based treatments were sought after. Wild plants were also eaten in times of distress. In the mid-1300s, the Black Plague killed nearly 60% of Europe's population. Many agricultural fields were abandoned and food became scarce. The poor survivors ate whatever could be found free growing in nearby fields, hedgerows, and woods. 100 herbs to add to the pudding. The strong, bitter flavors of these wild plants seemed to define the lives of those who ate them. Initially, the church did not discourage foraging and the use of herbs. In fact, many monasteries had extensive medicinal gardens, and the monks produced numerous hand-drawn herbal manuscripts. But until the printing press was developed in the 15th century, these handmade books were very rare and inaccessible to most people. As a result, most herbal knowledge was therefore kept alive as folk medicine, handed down from mother to daughter. But it was becoming increasingly difficult for poor women in Europe to practice their herb craft. Something called land enclosures in England and other parts of Europe were turning common gathering lands into private property. This made some kinds of agriculture more efficient, and it freed up labor for the Industrial Revolution. But it destroyed the diverse pre-existing ecosystems where many wild plants had thrived. The swamps and fens were drained. The meadows were plowed up and used to pasture sheep. The forests were cut down. The heaths were bounded by hedges and fences. Even as early as the 16th century, the British government discouraged farmers from allowing their fields to turn into meadow, letting them lie fallow, as this was seen as turning the earth to sloth and idleness. Letting a field be out of agricultural production was considered the greatest and most dangerous nuisance and damage to the common people. And this idea reflected a long-standing European concern about idleness in both people and nature. And increasingly, those who knew about wild plants were considered witches. Between 1450 and 1750 in Europe and North America, an estimated 35,000 to 100,000 people were put to death for practicing witchcraft and wildcrafting. Over in the Americas, before European contact, the indigenous people used an enormous number of plants. It is estimated that they used over 2,600 different species of plants for food or medicine. Colonialism caused a mass genocide of the indigenous people here, and it also brought an entirely different ecology to this country. Settlers introduced many plants while others arrived by accident. Many of the plants you might forage for today were in fact brought here and have naturalized over time since the colonists brought them. This includes wineberries, mullein, autumn olive, garlic mustard, field garlic, chickweed, white clover, and dandelions. But even just 200 years ago, half the American diet was found in the wild. And wild foods continue to be an important part for the next few centuries. But as the agricultural market economy expanded, eating wild plants began to be associated with poverty. And the trend toward eating less wild plants has accelerated, even as the same trend has occurred in our domestic food options. And you can see from this graph our dwindling food variety. So in 1903, you could get 408 different kinds of peas. And today you can really only find 25 pea varieties. So this trend towards reducing the diversity of foods that we ate, which began a long time ago, kind of accelerated in the 20th century. So as I mentioned, there's evidence that humans have used 30,000 plant species for food or medicine. And today we rely primarily on just 30. So it's an incredible reduction. 60% of our diets is made up of just 3 annual crops. And 80% of our agriculture is made up of annuals that must be replanted every year. In many ways, though, there is wisdom to eating the wild. Craving these flavors goes back to our earliest origins as hunter-gatherers. The taste for untamed food is deeply rooted in human health and psychology. We evolved eating many different foods, bites of this and that, a biodiversity of flavors much greater than we eat today. Most of our domesticated varieties are highly inbred monocultures that are generally less flavorful and less nutritious than their wild counterparts. which tend to contain higher concentrations of essential nutrients, such as vitamin A and C, thiamine, riboflavin, iron, and trace minerals. Eating a diversity of wild foods is also associated with higher rates of gut flora diversity, which correlates to better measures of health. So the increasing homogenization and standardization of agriculture is actually making us sick. Our psyches, our palates, and our physiques were not made for such uniform food. We yearn for the taste of the wild. In fact, beyond eating wild nature, there's many benefits to our well-being, both physical and psychological, that come from being in nature. These include improved attention, lowered stress, better mood, reduced risk of psychiatric and substance use disorder, increases empathy and cooperation, promotes cognitive development and self-control behaviors in children, improves working memory, cognitive flexibility and intentional control, creates meditation and flow states, calms anxiety, and perks up a tired brain. Since we evolved in wild settings and relied on the immediate environment for survival, our desire to connect with nature is innate. It's in our bodies and our brains. Spending time in nature triggers a physiological response that lowers stress levels and restores our ability to concentrate and pay attention. It increases our happiness and well-being, and it gives us a feeling of purpose in life and a sense of meaning. It's also been found that time in nature has positive effects on social interactions. Researchers have found that nature actually makes us nicer, both to each other and to the planet. And yet, we are on stolen land in this country, and access to nature is still incredibly uneven, often based on lines of racism and poverty. This is a map of New York City that shows where access to green space is the highest. And if you know New York City, you can see that the spaces that don't have access to green spaces are correlated with along poverty and racial lines. So really addressing environmental justice requires us to address racial justice as well. Besides that, we keep crowding out the natural world. The disappearance of wild places has diminished our food options. It is estimated that we will lose 30 to 50% of other life forms with whom we share the planet by mid-century. Dozens of species go extinct every single day. So many edible species and varietals have vanished to standardization, uniformity, and predictable tastes. It is easy to feel as though we are lacking some vital nourishment. And this is a paper that came out last year, and it's just very striking. Human-made mass now exceeds all living biomass. So all of our plastic and buildings and material goods, the quantity of that is greater, the mass of that is greater than the animals and trees and shrubs and other things that make up the living world. And the quantity of stuff that we're making has been doubling every 20 years. So it's easy to feel depressed about the state of the environment. And when I start feeling depressed about these kinds of statistics, I like to think about the soil. There are 70,000 different types of soil in the US. It takes about 500 years to form 1 inch of topsoil. So it's an incredibly precious process. In just 1 tablespoon of soil, there are more organisms in it than there are people in the world. There are 5,000 different types of bacteria in 1 gram of soil. And it's estimated that in 1 acre of cropland, there are 1,400,000 earthworms. And something about these facts just brings my heart joy. And sometimes I also meditate on nature's capacity for renewal. Just by renewing our coastal wetlands, we could offset the emissions generated by more than 2 billion barrels of oil. This would also reduce flood damage to oceanside communities by up to 30%. And then I like to think about our capacity to help that renewal. So this is a map from the Beacon Food Forest in Seattle, which is a park that combines agroforestry and permaculture design principles to create a diverse and resilient edible landscape. When we renew nature, we renew ourselves. We are embedded in the ecosystems that sustain us. We are all part of a planetary co-evolution. So how do we expand our sense of flavor again and our capacity to perceive new flavors? We do not technically have a sense of flavor. Flavor emerges in our brains from the synthesis of all other sensory inputs: touch, taste, sight, smell, sound. And these are combined with the much more elusive quality of memory. This multi-sensory perception evolved to help us determine what to eat, how to avoid poisonous plants, and discover new yummy things. It became so complex because it is fundamental to keeping us alive. Generally, we crave flavors that are sweet or fatty because these were limiting factors in our diets for the majority of human history. But we also like complex flavors because they signify micronutrients that are necessary to our cells. And while we might naturally be averse to bitterness, we learn to enjoy it. Many of our most beloved medicines and stimulants are bitter, which signifies potency. And I wanted to share this screenshot from a Chef's Table episode with the South Korean chef Jeong Kwan. Her definitions of flavor helped me realize that we can continue to expand our creativity and understanding of food. And that flavor connects us to landscapes and to each other. So I love that her definition of the five senses are body, feeling, perception, intention, and consciousness. What kind of flavors can we seek out when we take this as our sensory inputs? So here's my advice for expanding flavor by learning to forage. First, walk the same place many times over the course of a year before you harvest anything. Notice how the seasons change the plant composition, the species that are living there. Think of plants as having agency and life histories, just like we do. And learn about the larger ecology and indigenous history of the land where you are gathering. And this is something that I grew up with, having sort of hippie parents, but if you can, ask permission of the plant you're about to harvest. And if you're always hearing yes, then you're not asking correctly. This is really a beautiful practice to get grounded in what you're doing and to connect with this plant that you're about to consume. So see if you can listen to the plant's desires as well. So this is just a little taste of a lot more research and poetry that's in my book, Feasting Wild. And thank you. I'm really looking forward to your questions and to talking with Alexis.
I'm over here clapping. That was absolutely wonderful. And I mean, I didn't have to walk far to grab my copy of your book because it's one of my favorites. I've been like reading excerpts of it to my TikTok followers for pretty much the past year since it came out. So thank you. Oh my gosh. Do we just get to jump in? Are we doing this?
What do you want to talk about?
Well, I want to brag for 2 seconds, only because it ties into what we're talking about these Japanese knotweed scones that I literally finished right before we began this talk. Just an example of our constantly changing ecosystem and a plant that we vilify, even though we're the reason that it's here, and how we could be living much more harmoniously with it.
Yeah, I mean, Japanese knotweed's an interesting one where people call it invasive or, introduced And yet, as you've shown, there's so many valuable qualities to it and edible qualities.
Oh my gosh. And people are starting to do studies now looking into using some of like the root and some of the properties for like treat myriad of different like disorders and whatnot. And if there's one thing I'm looking forward to in the coming decades, it is kind of ethnobotany being this method through which a lot of folk medicine and a lot of what a lot of indigenous people especially know about plants already will get to come to the forefront of the stage and actually be studied in the way that they should have been from the beginning.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, part of what I uncovered with my research was this process where eating wild plants was something everyone did. And then it shifted into being something that academics studied. And that the sort of, white male privilege class, they became the owners of that information, even though they were often using women and indigenous people and enslaved people to gather that knowledge for them.
Nothing breaks my heart more than people who feel like foraging is an activity specifically reserved for white men with doctorate degrees. Right. No hate, no shade to white men with doctorate degrees. You guys are great too. You are
love them too. Yeah, so I think, the question then is how do we start doing this ethically, right? Because we want more and more people to forage. To me, it's a basic human right in a way. It connects us to our heritage, to our bodies, to the landscape. And yet there's a lot of us. So as you've shown, eating invasives is one way to do that without harming native plant populations.
Exactly. What you said about asking permission, I think, is also so important because there are a lot of different ways to receive your answer to that question. One of the ways you can receive that answer is using your eyes and taking a look around you and seeing how much of what you want to gather is actually present. If you are standing on a hillside or a floodplain here in Ohio and you want to gather ramps and you only see one, guess what? I don't care how many times you ask, that ramp is saying no. That ramp is saying, leave me alone. Give me some time. I gotta split this bulb a couple of times. I gotta put down some more seeds. Give me a minute. Whereas on the other side of that coin is if you are out here in the countryside in some areas that have been untouched for decades upon decades, and there are ramps as far as the eye can see. I mean, that's the flip side of it, is asking. And receiving that yes, knowing that as long as you are being conscious with what parts you are gathering and how much, that you have kind of entered into a symbiotic relationship with that space. Maybe that means you come back in the summertime after those ramps have flowered and put seeds out and you help disperse the last couple of seeds off of all of those seed heads. Sometimes they get stuck. If you love the oniony, garlicky goodness of ramps, I feel like the least you can do for them is go back through those patches later in the season and tend to them and check on them. And when people think about ethically going about foraging and foraging in a way that is more indigenous minded, that's part of the deal. It's smart for you and for that plant to kind of have a little handshake, leaf shake with one another, that you will take care of each other because that is how you both continue into the future. So I think as long as you are being future minded with your harvest, you are already thinking the correct way about it.
Absolutely. And that's part of why I always tell people, spend a year walking this place. The sort of forager rule of thumb is take 10%, leave 90% behind for nature. But if you don't know how many other people are gathering in an area, if you don't know the capacity of the land, or even how that season's climate is going to affect things, maybe it's a dry year and the ramps aren't doing as well. So if you can spend a year really getting to know a place, I think that is also helpful for this, ethical way of consuming wild foods.
Absolutely. And it's also wonderful because you get to experience the plant at all of these different stages of its life cycle, which I think is beautiful. So much of what we get in the grocery store, we are familiar with one stage in that plant's life. When you see broccoli, that is one part of the plant and one stage of its life, and that is all that you are familiar with. Whereas when you are out foraging, especially with a lot of our wild brassicas, native and non, with broccoli being another example of a brassica, you get to learn what that initial basil rosette looks like, what that inflorescence looks like, what the seed pods end up looking like. And you also get to learn that there are a lot of different stages, and each of those stages sometimes have different applications, food-wise, medicine-wise. And it makes you appreciate the plant that much more. It makes you see it as like a whole being with a story that it tells every single season, just like we do the same thing. It deepens your appreciation. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point that, the Western way of thinking about time is very linear, but obviously plants thinking of time is very cyclical. And I immediately thought about dandelions, which you can eat the leaves in early spring, and then you can eat the flowers. I think you have recipes of like fritters or something. Yeah. And then you can actually use the root for medicinal things to make teas and stuff. So understanding that these plants have different aspects over time is fantastic. Exactly. And it just increases that diversity even more.
And yeah, it helps you connect with your surroundings better. I think that it's very beautiful to be able to walk into a space, visually survey it, and be like, yes, it is this time of year. This is the time when the ramp leaves are starting to yellow and they are putting up their flower buds. It is the time when the cutleaf toothwort is releasing its seeds if you accidentally brush against it while you're walking through the woods. The beech trees are putting out their first tiny little leaves creeping out of their very skinny little leaf buds, which are very tasty, by the way, if no one has ever eaten the tiny little beech leaves while they're still shiny and pretty see-through. It's a great way to connect with your surroundings. And I think it is I don't want to say it's a better calendar than the traditional calendar that we use, but it feels more natural following it, if that makes any sense at all.
Yeah, and I think, we're going through a period with such kind of climactic upheaval. People are calling it climate weirding instead of global warming, because some places are getting frosts in really late stages in the season. And weather has always been somewhat unpredictable, but knowing your surroundings is one way to really start tapping into the large scale global changes that are happening. And then maybe motivate you to actually go out and protest or engage in politics to try and help help change that trajectory that we're on.
Exactly. If your city has
I love that foraging is like this free thing to do, right? Like everyone loves free, but it's in many ways a way of existing outside of what has felt like the sort of totality of global capitalism, right? And the ways that these multinational corporations are making decisions about what kind of vegetables we even have available. Yeah. Can you talk a bit about that too, and how that relates to access?
Absolutely. So if we're wanting to get very, very micro, I live in a predominantly Black and historically Black neighborhood in Columbus, Ohio. It is a food desert. You have to leave our neighborhood if you want to be able to buy any food that doesn't come in a plastic bag or shrink wrapped. You cannot get groceries in our neighborhood. And so for me, getting to teach at the community garden, getting to teach the other kids in our neighborhood that there are ways to combat that almost feel like a sneaky little middle finger to the system. Because it's not like we don't have a grocery store because there's not space. I'm pretty active with our very hyper local neighborhood committee, and every couple of years we put in a request, and we are just not where those businesses want to be. So why not just take our nutrition into our own hands? This is not a one-off story. All of the other predominantly poor and predominantly Black neighborhoods in Columbus have the exact same thing going on. I'm lucky that the neighborhood that I'm in has a good amount of tree cover and has pocket parks. Our other two poorest neighborhoods, on average, are about 5 degrees hotter in the middle of summer than the rest of the city, which, then we can dive into environmental racism and how that plays a role in the way that we move through the world too. But foraging is just such a great way to take care of both yourself and those around you when it feels like you've kind of been left behind by everyone else.
Absolutely. And I think we were talking about this yesterday on the phone, but when you start to see your landscape as edible, you stop wanting to throw Roundup on it and pollutants, and you start thinking about, car culture and how the pollutants from driving around on roads is going to affect the edible plants that you're looking for. And so I think every time that you find a new plant that you can connect to on a food level, our stomachs are so tied to our brains. There's something like 500 neurons in our stomach. So it's really this totally connected thing to have our emotional response and our stomachs connected. And I think the more wild plants that you can connect to in that way, then you start to it opens up your perception of all these other things in the world and all these ways that we really could very easily shift our interactions with nature to make it a healthier place for everybody, right? Even the way that we deal with invasives is often spraying them with poisons, when the role that they might be playing in that ecology with a little tending or a little weeding might actually be really beneficial.
Absolutely. I love weeding and eating. I said snack, don't spray in a video earlier today, and now I'm really wishing I had replaced it with weeding and eating.
Next video.
Next video. But when you see that value, like you said, in your spaces around you, you want to take care of things when you see the value in them. And with each edible plant that you learn, your land seems that much more valuable to you. And what seemed like an area to just like hang out with your friends and throw cigarette butts when you're done with them, and spray Roundup along the edges of the sidewalk, suddenly becomes like a micro food forest. You can't run out and grab that chickweed out of your front yard to put on your afternoon sandwich if you're worried about what you have been throwing into your own yard. So one household at a time, we are taking better care of the land, and then in turn taking better care of ourselves.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned valuing the land. It also opens up our capacity to talk about value. So it's no longer about an economic value or sort of what something might be worth in that level, but it's like valuing this planet that sustains us, and also valuing our heritage, right? And our ancestors and all the people throughout all the years, millennia, that were able to take this plant knowledge and pass it down. So I'm actually curious how you got started on the wild plant world.
Yeah. Okay. Only if I get to ask you the same question.
Okay, sounds good.
I think a lot of other women in this space kind of had a lot of my first bits of knowledge handed down to me from my mother. My mother is very into gardening. She worked for Procter & Gamble when I was growing up, which is like, directly in conflict with a lot of the things that I feel about the world. But the way that she would decompress on the weekends was tending to this huge, beautiful garden that she had in the front yard of our house. So if I wanted to hang out with her, I would also have to be in the garden. I like to think that I was helping. In retrospect, knowing more 5-year-olds, I probably wasn't. But she would quiz me on the plants while I was out there. And I loved learning all of them. But the ones that stuck with me the most were these accidental sources of food, were the onion grass, the dandelions, the burdock, where I would just be like, you're telling me that these plants have value. You had to put no time and effort into them. They are just here. And they're just as nutritionally dense, if not more so, than some of the seeds for some of the other plants that you're growing in the yard. And as a child, I was like, why aren't we talking about this? I was like, this is a global phenomenon. I thought I discovered foraging. I was like, why doesn't everybody know that there's a grocery store in their neighborhood? And then, of course, I got older and my dad was like, you dummy. Like I wasn't on the sides of the road picking poke salad with my 8 brothers and sisters to bring home when I was a kid too. And so I really got a lot of it. I really got a lot of it from my mom and my dad. My mom's mom was born in like the early 1920s and worked in the cranberry bogs in Massachusetts during the Great Depression to help better support her family. Most people tell you not to drop out of middle school and hang out outside all the time. Being this far into adulthood, I don't know, dropping out of middle school and hanging out all the time still yielded a wonderful human being. So academia is fun. so was being outside. And so she learned a whole lot of different native plants just being out there and learning word of mouth from other people who she interacted with. The Wampanoag tribe out on the Cape is still pretty active today. So there's a lot of transfer of information between people of color in that general region. And I was just lucky enough to get to inherit some of it. I just got obsessed and then read every single book about plants that I could get my hands on. But what about you, Gina? I need to know.
I have a very similar story of growing up in my mom's garden, and it was slightly different because it was New Mexico, and so we'd occasionally have rattlesnakes next to the tomatoes. But it was the same thing of just kind of being in awe that like nature could produce this abundance. And I was lucky enough to grow up on about 20 acres. So we also had kind of these wild spaces. Lived on a crazy dirt road. So I always joke that I didn't really have friends because no one wanted to drive this winding dirt road to come visit me. And so really the plants became my friends. I would just go sit in the arroyos and try and find piñon nuts to eat and or go up into the mountains and look for wild raspberries. So for me, it was also something that came from a very young exposure. And I, say to anyone out there with kids, like take them outside as soon as possible, right? Like the more we can ingrain this stuff at a young age, the better. Which is not to say that you can't start learning it now. I've noticed there's been some questions just about how do you get started. And I think one of the best things you can do is find a mentor or find a friend who's willing to take you out. Because as much as reading books is helpful, it's really being on the ground, noticing the really subtle differences between a plant that can kill you and a plant that is edible. And being taught that in a more physical kind of on the ground way, I think is really, really important. Absolutely. So there are definitely local mushroom foraging chapters and local foraging groups, or start one with your friends and don't eat anything for a while until you're just absolutely certain. Or, you can probably recommend a few things besides dandelions that are very easy to identify. Edible flowers, perhaps. Yeah.
Absolutely. If you're kicking it on the eastern half of the United States like I am right now, burdock is already getting very big in Ohio this season. You'll recognize it from the very ruffly, almost elephant ear leaves coming out of those big basil rosettes. It's really fun watching them go from first years to second years. It's kind of like seeing a gangly teenager in their first year and then seeing like a fully robust adult. And I get surprised by it every single year. Every year I'm like, oh no, you're so tiny. You're not going to have leaves that are the size of my head next year. And then without fail, they always do. And burdock is another one that is invasive and that we get so mad about here in North America, as if gobo isn't a very common vegetable in a ton of Asian cuisine. And gobo is just burdock root. We're very good at framing the narrative incorrectly. I used to joke with my mom that all of the plants on the Roundup bottle were edible. So I didn't get why we were I didn't get why Roundup was being sold, like ever, as a kid. Now they don't put plants on it anymore because I think enough people called them out about it that they were just like, well, if we don't teach people what the plants are, they can't find out anything else about them. They'll just know they want to get rid of them because they can't recognize them.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think that's an important point too about, well, now I've lost my train of thought, but anyway.
I want to say, I love you pointing out that your friends were plants. Because like one of my earliest friends, I was going to put it in air quotes, but it doesn't deserve to be in air quotes, was a honeysuckle tree named Priscilla. I named her after my great aunt. And she was the best. I was really bad at climbing trees as a kid, but she was a very climbable tree. And I'd just hang out and eat honeysuckle flowers during the springtime and gather berries to make like ink with during the fall.
Yeah.
And like prune or broken branches and whatnot. And then my elementary school cut Priscilla down. And it was a bad day for tiny Alexis. But I think when you start thinking of your relationship with plants as a relationship, it is crazy how much faster and more confident I feel you get with identification, because you start getting to know them in the same ways that your brain tries to get to know people. It starts looking for some of those same kinds of cues.
And I think that's an excellent point, because indigenous cultures, they haven't done everything right. I don't really believe in a harmonious relationship with nature. Humans always have some sort of impact. But I think the thing that so many of them value is this idea that we are in relationship at all times with the natural world, right? And we've really forgotten that in the sort of Western capitalist technological world that we live in, that this is actually about relating to something other than the human world. So the non-human world is out there, and it makes up this, huge part of the system that we're in. And I think you're right, having that idea of relationship with plants is so, so important, because then you start to feel grief for something, and you start to feel empathy, and you start to have these connections that are beyond just like, oh, you look delicious, right?
Exactly.
And then I think, as you mentioned too, it connects you to your ancestors. So my great grandmother was also a forager, and I didn't really know that much about her, but there were sort of stories that she would go up into the Catskills and harvest something that reminded her of home. So that's another great way that people can get started on this journey is go back to your family records and see what you can find out, because more likely than not, someone in your family a generation ago or 2 generations ago still had this capacity and this practice in their lives.
I loved what you mentioned during your presentation about the way that we kind of lost touch with foraging over the last 200 years, is it very much became synonymous with poverty, which interestingly enough, I think in a lot of areas, especially once you get towards Appalachia out here, is there are a lot of folks who kept that practice going within their families because not everybody's economy got to bounce back after the Depression ended. Like some people still very much needed to rely on that form of sustenance, even with like the economic boom that happened during World War II, and everyone being like, well, if you don't have a nice house with a picket fence in suburbia with your perfect lawn and your wife who goes and picks up the groceries every single day to make dinner, then something is wrong with you. And I know it's funny because for my dad's side of the family, that was very poor, part coming from the South, part coming from Appalachia. They kept their foraging practice even through when like my dad was a kid, until his mom passed away when he was in high school. Whereas on my mom's side of the family, because they were in the Northeast and very much trying to communicate like wealth and security during the course of the 20th century, almost nearly completely lost touch with something that they had been doing. Like my mom's family's been in Massachusetts since the 1600s, and they were farmers for the first 150 years that they were here. And I'm just like, we have to know more about plants, guys. Like what's going on? You don't tend land for that long. Yeah. But it's easy to forget things when you want to.
Yeah, and part of what we're dealing with as we are, the weird part is that foraging is now somewhat of a luxury, because you have to have the time and the access to be able to go out and forage, right? So something that's been associated with poverty, with the trendiness of it, is starting to be more of a luxury. And I think it's important to remember, part of why I advocate for land back movements is because we are on indigenous land, we're on stolen land. So much of that plant knowledge was lost during colonization. And so, there's a question of appropriation of, is it really right for us to be out there harvesting things? And one thing that I've started to explore more is this idea that we're kind of all indigenous to somewhere, right? So can you go back to your ancestors pre-settler colonialism and understand the plants that they perhaps used? So for me, in New Mexico, there's a tradition here of burning sage for both spiritual reasons, And that sage is somewhat threatened by the sort of trendiness of burning sage, right? White sage is no longer easily accessible for Native people who've been using it for millennia. So I started looking into my Sicilian background, and they had a similar thing of burning herbs, but in that case, it was a wild rosemary. So the question is, how can you start to orient yourself away from like, oh, what is this trendy food? It's ramps. And say, no, perhaps those ramps do actually belong to the people whose land it has been for thousands and thousands of years. But what kind of onion is there that might have actually been connected to my cultural heritage, right? So that's another way to start expanding the way that we talk about some of this stuff in terms of appropriation. And it comes down to really knowledge and educating and getting in touch with your own roots, I think, which can be hard, right? If you come from a background of enslaved peoples, there's a lot of grief and trauma that has to be processed in order to start accessing that, or there might even not be the records of that, history.
It's tough. It's very tough. And as a person who is like, I can trace my family history nearly perfectly on one half of my family, on my mom's side of the family, which isn't because they were white. It was just because my great ×8 grandfather fought in the Revolutionary War. And when you're in the military, people care and write down your name when things happen to you and your family members. And then there's my dad's side of the family, which we say this jokingly because if you don't joke about it, you cry. And it's like the 1-2 punch of both Indigenous and enslaved Black ancestry. And we're just like, you get to my great grandparents on that side and it stops.
Yeah.
You can't go any further back in either direction. And so I think it's a really touchy subject, always telling people like, well, why don't you go back and find exactly what it is that held this place for you? Because then when it all comes down to it, now we're all here. Mm-hmm. Some of us are here, even though we did not want to be.
Absolutely.
And so it's kind of finding a way to live as harmoniously with the space that you are now occupying as possible. And I do think for most of us, that looks like eating your invasives. I mean, not only is it good for not putting insane chemicals into the ground, but it's also good for keeping your native flora and fauna the way that they should be. We also don't talk about the way invasive plants have a weird effect on like birds and rodents. We have a lot of autumn olives here, which is like a pretty sugary, like once it gets later in the season, a pretty sugar dense, very prolific bush. So if you're in an area where birds want to eat berries, those berries weren't there 150 years ago. Birds are like having weird issues because they're eating a ton more and a lot of things that they weren't eating during any history of their evolution. So eat your invasives feels like the safest and most comprehensive like paintbrush to sweep across that entire question, and do the ancestry work if you're capable.
Yeah. I think I appreciate you bringing up that point. Absolutely, that it's not possible for everyone to go back to those roots, and to figure out how to be good stewards of the places that we live now, right? Given these horrible histories that are part of everyone's legacy, whether you are on the receiving end or the perpetrating end, on some level. So I think we're getting kind of close to the end. So why don't we answer some of these wonderful questions that are popping up? Hopefully we answered a few of them in the discussion. So what do you recommend is a good place to start learning about wild and edible plants for people who live in urban environments?
Oh, okay. Do I have books? I have books. I didn't mean to have props. I'm just always reading or always brushing up on things. I'm really loving Samuel Thayer's IDing books. His writing is just really approachable, and he also gives you a like calendar at the front of each book that tells you when things are coming in and out of season. I feel like that's half the game with wild plants, is being like, okay, well, I know that this is here, but I have no idea when I'm supposed to be looking for it. And I think that that's nice and hopeful, and he does a good job of focusing on native and non-native species, and focusing on a lot of plants that you can find in cityscapes. Like you're going to find curly dock growing out of the cracks in the sidewalk in your neighborhood this time of year. My other suggestion, kind of piggybacking off of what Gina said earlier, join a local foraging Facebook group. If you live in an area that has more than 500 people in it, I guarantee you that one exists. Join one, because at least for your first couple of weeks, months, years, until you feel comfy enough to forage yourself that you're in them, what you will get is people posting pictures constantly of what is in season and what they are finding, and that will help you get the rhythm of what's in season in your space. And you can make some friends and go out with them, because there's nothing better than seeing the plant in all 3 dimensions in real time. That's when I feel like the actual real learning happens, is when you get to witness it in person. There are smells that are associated with plants that you cannot communicate through a book. There are textures that you associate with plants that you cannot communicate through a book. So use your eyes for a bit, but then get out there with people who know more than you, and soon you'll be where they are too.
Absolutely. And I think, another thing to do is to get into the gardening scene, because it's not quite foraging, but it might help as you're getting familiar with plants and the land that you're living in, to start having a relationship to plants. And there's so many more and more community gardens popping up where the access is there, the resources are there, and the wild weeds and invasives are there to harvest as well. So that's another great way to start connecting with this.
Nothing will make you friends with the community garden more than asking if you can weed your neighbor's plot. You don't have to tell them that you are going to eat the things you're pulling up, or you can, and you can share that knowledge with them. And then, then the next time they're going to weed it themselves and take it home. I don't know. Be future-minded in whether or not you want to tell them.
Yes, and I think that's an important point too, like be future-minded, right? The whole world feels like it's sped up, and every second you're getting a new notification. And what if we start thinking about a time and on the scale of trees that live for 300 years? Like, what is their experience of time? And what is their experience of the environment if you start to slow down your idea of what the future means too?
Nothing makes me more emotional than coming across giant oak trees in the middle of the forest. There's one in one of my favorite parks in Columbus that is at least 400 years old, and it's instant tears every time I see her, because our timelines are nothing to that tree. Our lifetimes,
blips.
We're just little blips. A whole lifetime of ours is a decade to that tree, which is just, it really puts things in perspective, and it makes you feel a little small, but in a way that makes you feel very interconnected with everyone else, because we are.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's become sort of like cliche and cheesy to say it, but I think this year has really brought that, that realization home, really like home, like we're all here. We're all in our homes because of the interconnectedness of the world, right? Yeah. So I think that's a super important point. Another resource, a couple other resources, which I can drop in the chat, or maybe someone else can. Gather Film is a really excellent film. I think it came out last year. A really beautiful film about indigenous wild foodways and how they are working to regenerate and kind of reclaim these lost foodways. And there's action items in there too that you can help with. Another one, and I'm not finding her name, but it's The Curb on Instagram.
I love Candice.
Yeah, because there were some questions in the chat about pollutants and environmental, and she's done a lot of really interesting studies looking at how certain plants soak up more pollutants than others. How if you actually tested what you bought in the grocery store, you'd find that so much of what you're eating is full of crap anyway. So not to worry as much about foraging. So that's a great thing as well. Do you know her last name?
That's Candice Thompson. Candice with a D-A, like Candice with an A at the end, not an I.
Yeah.
She's a wonderful resource and just a stellar human being who really puts her money where her mouth is in terms of food access and food education. She ate a pigeon once just to see if it was like worthwhile to do that in a city. She's in Brooklyn, she's in New York, where because of human intervention, the pigeon population is absolutely insane. Like it's absolutely out of control. I think what she landed on is that it was very heartbreaking and maybe not the answer now, but maybe an answer for someone in the future. But she is an excellent resource. And I quote her study about heavy metal levels in leafy greens in the grocery store all the time, because that's the question that I get most is, how do you know that what you are gathering isn't like putting tiny amounts of lead or cadmium into your blood? And I'm just like, the horrible answer is it is, but so is everything else.
I know. The sad fact, I heard a statistic that we eat a credit card size of microplastic every single week, right? So these pollutants, these toxins, they are just everywhere now. until we start shifting away from a lot of these chemicals. So,
and you probably get less if you are foraging and like trapping, if that's a thing that you're doing, then that is a good way to decrease the inevitable amount of just non-digestible tummy no-nos, as I like to call them, that we are all slowly accumulating in our bodies.
So Candice's organization is a collaborative urban resilience banquet. So worth checking out. So here's a question for you, which I'm also happy to chime in on. I'm always amazed at your expertise in the kitchen when it comes to preparing or cooking foraged foods, and wondering how you find these recipes and how much is from your own experimentation.
Well, like I say that my foraging, my original foraging knowledge comes from my mom. My cooking knowledge comes from my dad. He is very skilled in the kitchen and very often flies by the seat of his pants. So I learned from a young age, instead of necessarily following recipes, to recognize the texture for a dough when you're, say, making scones. I did not follow a recipe. Do not ask me for measurements for this, because I don't have them for you yet. If you really want it, I will figure it out. I also went to culinary camp as an 8-year-old. I was the youngest one there. Never give 8-year-olds sharp knives. I didn't have the motor skills for that, but it was a really nice foundation in the way that I thought about food, because even for all of us like kids and teenagers, they were breaking it down into, well, you have acidic things that brighten dishes and lighten dishes. You have fatty things that kind of ground dishes. You have umami that makes dishes feel full, like it makes it feel like your dishes are filling when you're eating them, the way that it sits on your tongue. You have bitterness that you need to feel in your brain like you were eating something nutritious that you want to be eating. And then of course you have sweet and salty. And once you really break food down into those categories, it frees you up to experiment a lot. You can picture a taste that you want to have in your head and kind of break it down and be like, oh, well, it's going to be pretty fatty. And because it's going to be pretty fatty, I know that I need something acidic, and I know that I need something bitter to balance it out. Otherwise, it's going to be overwhelming and you're only going to want to eat one bite of it and then put it down, which I think is a lot of how we kind of stumbled through cooking prior to everybody and their cousin having a Betty Crocker cookbook in their kitchen. That being said, I also love knowing what foraged foods are a good dupe for, and doing a little googly search and being like, oh, if Japanese knotweed tastes like rhubarb and I am out of ideas, my brain is just going, when I think of what I want to do with all these shoots that I just harvested from under my porch, Japanese knotweed is going to eat this house alive. And that is one of a myriad of reasons why we're moving. And going and just seeing what other recipes are out there. And sometimes you can make a 1-for-1 trade. You can trade out June berries 1-for-1 with blueberries, and June berries are so much better. The Amelanchier species really has deliciousness on lock, so good for them. And sometimes it's a matter of experimentation. I turned this Japanese knotweed into a puree before I put it into the scones. And I was like, okay, well, this is liquid, which means I need to pull back on how much soy milk I'm putting in so they don't get too wet, which also means I don't need to put as much sugar into the batter because the puree is sweetened. It just becomes like a really fun puzzle in your head. And I think when you start thinking of cooking more like an artistry and more like an experiment, it becomes a lot more fun and a lot less like a taxing chore.
Yeah, I have a line in my book that's something like, we do not know which evolved first, our capacity for love or our desire to cook. Because really in the beginning, it was so experimental, and it was based on, these other aesthetic forms of flavor and taste and senses. And the things that we loved, we went back to again and again. And that was how our brains got tied into the emotions of our stomach, right? So if you think about cooking as being this very old and ancient art form, and I think you're right, an experimental art form as well, where you get to try things out. But it sounds like we need to write an Eat Your Invasives cookbook.
Okay, I'm already in. You all heard it first.
Right. You can all pre-order. Okay, well, we've gotten about 10 minutes over. So any last thoughts on the joys and pleasures and politics of foraging and biodiversity?
I will just say from a personal standpoint, I've always loved foraging. I didn't really get into it heavily until I needed to when I was fresh out of college and extremely broke and dealing with a whole lot of issues physically, mentally. And I mean, therapy is also great. No hate, no shade to therapy. Also go to therapy. But I think that making a point to go out into my surroundings, to supplement my food with wild foods, getting to create these relationships with spaces, with particular plants, helped me in a way that I never expected to. It was something that very much arose out of a need. And instead, what I found was like, oh, this is going to sound so schmaltzy, but instead what I found is it felt like my neighborhood was like writing a love letter back to me. I loved it so much. And then suddenly it felt like it loved me back. It felt like someone was looking out for me. And sometimes when you're at your lowest, like that's all that you need to start moving in the other direction. So I don't know, if you're feeling very nervous about foraging, take it very slow. Nature is not going anywhere. She'll be waiting for you whenever you're ready. And listen. That's the best advice that I can give while you're foraging is to listen always.
Yeah, deeply with your whole body, all of your senses. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for being in conversation with me today. Such a pleasure. Thank you to Yale, Peabody, and everyone there who helped organize this. Really grateful to have this space together. And thank you to the audience for your questions and comments and showing up today.
So I can't do anything less but echo what you just shared. First of all, I would love to sit here all night and listen to you two talk. What an inspiration, really. I'm just loving it. And I hope you two do at some point take up writing a book or publish something in a show or something like that. I don't know how to say thank you enough.
Dinner party.
Well, it was very terrific. You know what? I just love both of you. I can't get enough of you. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Big head alert over here. Oh my gosh. I'm just so happy to have been invited and to be involved. This has been the highlight of my entire week.
Well, let us look forward to more, okay? And be sure, if you haven't posted, both of you on chat already, be sure to let us know how we can follow you. So, you know, we don't have to wait for another program to come, but pump it in there before we lose the audience. I would also like to say thank you, by the way, to the audience for joining us. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as we all have in terms of putting it together. And Gina Rae and Alexis, thank you again for all your time and effort, hard work. What a joy, really. Thank you so much. Last, I would say, stay tuned for more from the Peabody coming up. Please follow us on social media or sign up for our mailing list through our Connect box on our homepage. And that way you can be sure you're going to hear about all our upcoming programs. And lastly, I just want to say bon appetit to all. Enjoy your eating and thank you all again.
Bye.
Bye.